All right, now I want to show you how to implement the example challenge using auto layout constraints. And remember from the last lesson, this is the view that we want to create. So we want to add a blue view and a green view to the canvas, and we have a couple of requirements for the two views that we need to fulfill. So I commented out the first solution from the last lesson where we set all the frames directly. And this time we're actually going to implement the same view using auto layout constraints. And for that, I already created the blue view and the green view here, but with one very important difference, right? So if we recall how we created views before, we were passing in a frame. So here in the initializer of the green view, we're passing in the green frame for which we calculated all the values beforehand. But here this time, when creating the blue view and the green view, we're not passing in a frame. So what this means basically is that this is a view that has a frame that has no size. So the width and the height are just going to be 0, so we can't see it even if we add it to the canvas. And I'll prove that to you by saying canvas.addSubView blue view and also the green view. And once the canvas loads on the right side, we still won't be able to see anything. And that's just because the width and the height of both our views currently are 0 and 0. So we are never going to see anything. All right. So the next thing that is really important to note when we are dealing with auto layout programmatically is that we need to set a property on the blue view or basically on the view that we need to configure with auto layout constraints. And this property is called translates auto resizing masks into constraints, and we need to set this to false. And this really is just something that we need to do in order for the auto layout constraints to take an effect. If we don't do this, and this is actually a very common source of errors, so when you're Googling on Stack Overflow how to apply auto layout constraints programmatically, this is going to be the very first answer that you find in all the questions because people oftentimes forget. So when you're dealing with auto layout programmatically, make sure you're setting this property to false. All right. Now we're set and we can start defining the actual constraints. So let's start with the blue view. And for the blue view, we had a couple of requirements. Let's quickly review them. So it should have a margin, 20 points each to the leading and top to bottom edge. But actually, let's start with the width, because the width is defined in terms of the canvas. And that's really when the whole power of auto layout comes into play, when we are defining views in terms of each other, so when they have a relation between each other. So basically how we're going to do this is we're creating auto layout constraints by using the initializer for NSLayout constraint. And there are a couple of parameters that we have to pass through this initializers. And I'll explain each of them, but basically we have to pass two UI views and we have to define their relationship. So the first item here that we are passing is the first UI view, and then this second item here, the to item, is the second view. So we already know that we want to relate the blue view to the canvas because the blue view should be half the width, or the width of the blue view should be half the width of the canvas. So let's go and add these two parameters at first. We know that the first view is the blue view and the second view is the canvas. All right, so now we've got this attribute here. And this attribute, or actually two attributes, this relates to the different primitives that I showed you on the slides. So we can use the top, the bottom, the leading and the trailing edges of these views. We can use the center and the width and the height. In this case, we really want to use the width of the two views. So we need to say that the blue view's width should be in some relation to the width of the canvas. So we are setting both attributes of both items to width. All right, now let's talk about the NSLayout relation. Here we actually have only 3 options because it's implemented as an enum. And in all our cases, we're always only going to deal with equal. So we actually can ignore the other 2 for now. This is just going to be equal. All right, now we've gotten to a point where we already say that we want to relate the width of the blue view to the width of the canvas. So now we only have the multiplier and the constant left as values that we need to provide. And in fact, the multiplier is our opportunity to say how the two views should relate to each other, or rather, how the attributes of these two views should relate to each other. Well, because the width of the blue view should be half the width of the canvas, our multiplier is just going to be 0.5. And in this case, we have a constant of 0, and we don't really have to care about this right now. I'll explain more about the constant later on.